I think we'll get started. So welcome and thank you all for joining us today for a briefing hosted by the Critical Materials Caucus to discuss scaling domestic critical material supply chains. I'm excited to see we have looks like over 70 participants logged on so far. So thank you all for taking the time to join our briefing. As background, my name is Emma Bishop. I am an Assistant Vice President at Venn Strategies. Work closely with the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition. As way background for those of you less familiar with the coalition, BMTC was launched by Venn in December 2020 and is a group of 14 companies in the US and Canada dedicated to scaling a North American battery materials supply chain. I'm so excited to be hosting our second briefing with the Critical Materials Caucus for a conversation today on how Congress, agencies, and industry are working to bolster domestic rare earth element and battery material supply chains, both of which are considered critical materials. So as a quick run of show before we dive in, we will start with comments from the co-chairs of the Critical Materials Caucus, followed by remarks from Ms. Najib Block and Matt Zolnowski of the Defense Department. Round out our briefing today with a panel discussion looking at rare earth element and battery material developments. So to kick us off, I want to turn it over to our caucus co-chairs. I know we in BMTC and others across the critical materials industry are really grateful to see bipartisan leadership on this issue. It's critical to our national security and to our way of life. I do want to give a quick shout out to Sarah and Emily for helping pull this briefing today together. We really have enjoyed working with your staff on this. So with that, Congressman Eric Swalwell, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Emma. And also thank you to Matt Zolnowski for briefing the caucus on DPA's role in securing critical materials. And look, here we are, going into appropriations season right now, and we've got the National Defense Authorization Act today that we're going to be voting on. And I think it's fair to say that rare earth elements are no longer rare as far as a topic that is in the public realm. Because of your work and your advocacy, I do believe lawmakers understand that we needed to act yesterday to secure these critical materials. And with the leadership of my colleague, Guy Reschenthaler, and the late Don Young, who was also a co-chair of the caucus, as well as Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, we have elevated this issue as one that we need to take on in Congress. So I co-chair the bipartisan Critical Materials Caucus, just by way of introduction. And we started, frankly, to help the United States develop the technical expertise and production capabilities to assure a long-term, secure, and sustainable supply. And so the caucus has worked throughout the years to educate members that, frankly, until recently, did not know much about rare earth elements or critical elements. The caucus's one of our big successes was in 2020, a bill that I had authored was signed into law as a part of an appropriations package. It overhauled and funded research and development for materials critical for energy applications. I'm also now a lead appropriations letter. We've led an appropriations letter advocating for funding for the Critical Materials Institute at Ames Lab in Iowa and the Critical Materials Supply Chain Research Facility so that they can further enable research, development, demonstration, and commercialization activities throughout the supply chain for critical elements. Funding for this work, as you know, is essential. And we also have an amendment that was made in what we call order for tonight's vote that, again, would prioritize the issue of critical elements for the National Defense Authorization Act. And while we're making great progress on research and development, we still need help to incentivize actually manufacturing here in the United States. We know that we have vast resources that can be safely mined and extracted here in the United States. But when it comes to manufacturing and processing and magnetizing, it still is going over to China. And that's a real problem when you think about the type of materials that these rare earth elements go into that relate to our national security. And while globalization, of course, is good for us, it's good for the world, there are just some items, some goods, some projects that you do not want to rely on China for, and any national security related item is one of them. And that's why it's so important that we get the US in the game. We're also working to pass a competition bill, and I'm pushing to include funding for the Critical Materials Supply Chain Fund, which was included in the House bill. The $45 billion fund would support direct manufacturing and acquisition of vital goods. It would also strengthen domestic manufacturing, spur logistical and technological innovations in supply chains, and stockpile critical goods to build economic resilience. And I think we saw with the pandemic how important it is, to stockpile what you could need, whether in medical needs or certainly defense production needs. Today, we're here to talk about two critical rare earth supply chains in particular, for lithium-ion batteries and for rare earth magnets, both of which are core pillars of economic competitiveness, decarbonization, and national security. And I can tell you, having just been over to Indonesia, Singapore, in the Middle East in the last 2 weeks, China is investing worldwide to seek lithium resources because they recognize how important they are. And that's why it's so important that the US is not just in the game, but leading on the field. Fortunately, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed, with nearly 70 votes in the Senate, Republican and Democratic votes, and many votes on the Republican side in the House, includes $3.1 billion to make more batteries and components in America by supporting the creation of new, retrofitted, and expanded commercial facilities, as well as manufacturing demonstrations and battery and recycling. The Department of Energy also recently announced a separate $60 million fund to support second life applications for batteries once used to power electronic vehicles, as well as new processes for recycling materials back into the supply chain. So we've got to spur domestic production. We know that. We've got to make and put in place tax credits that incentivize this. And that's why I've introduced the Rare Earth Permanent Magnet Manufacturing Production Tax Credit. Let's just call it a production tax credit, with Congressman Reschenthaler, who understands this especially uniquely because of his Western Pennsylvania district. It's a bipartisan bill to create a production tax credit for rare earth magnets that are manufactured in the United States. No domestic manufacturing currently exists. That's hard to believe. No domestic manufacturing currently exists, although there are two producers who are in the process of developing plants in the United States. So the $14 billion a year rare earth magnet market, it's more than 60% controlled by China, which is, as I said, increasingly using rare earth elements and finished and semi-finished products as opposed to exporting the magnets. Industry sources estimate that the global rare earth magnet market will nearly double by 2027, but China will continue to be able to dominate the market because of low production costs. Similarly, China dominates the global lithium supply by upwards of 70% of the total global lithium battery manufacturing capacity being controlled in China. So should they decide to decrease supply, which we've seen in the past with rare earth elements, or dramatically raise prices, it would dramatically impact the automotive industry, which also would dramatically impact our ability to quickly adopt lithium battery powered electric vehicles. So I look forward to hearing from the panelists. Emma, I can't thank you enough for working with our staff. And I think we all agree this is an area where we want America, or at least in compacts with allied countries like Australia and Japan and others, to work together to counter the edge that China has. And with that, I will yield back to Emma and look forward to seeing what ideas you have for how we can better lead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Congressman. I couldn't agree more with you that there really is a need to scale this industry given China's stranglehold on it. And I think having our folks from the Defense Department on the line today to talk more about the national security implications of that and why it's so important is really beneficial. So thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you so much for you and Congressman Reschenthaler's leadership on this issue. Again, I just want to emphasize how important it is for all of us and for the world to see bipartisan support behind this issue. And so with that, I will now turn it over and transition us toward our Defense Department panelists. So this does segment us well into the next segment of our briefing. As a flag for all attendees, we will now be monitoring the Q&A function. So if you have questions that you would like to ask our panelists, we will try to get to those throughout the rest of the program today. And I now want to introduce our next speaker, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Resilience, Ms. Najib Locke. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
We
Wonderful.
can.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And similarly, I would like to thank Congressman Swalwell and Congressman Rechenwather, who I know are on. Thank you so much. And to the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition for the invitation today to open what I expect will be a dynamic and engaging meeting about increasing the resilience in our domestic supply chains. So as said, my name is Halima Najib Locke, and I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Resilience in the Office of Industrial Base Policy. Our team recently led the 100-day report on critical minerals under Executive Order 14017, and we manage the DoD's Defense Production Act, Title I and Title III programs, among others. From that 100-day report, you probably saw we issued this past February an annual report that really flushed out all of the topics of which critical materials was one of our focus areas. So to that, critical materials or in DoD speak, strategic and critical materials are the building blocks of a thriving economy and a strong national defense. This is because they can be found in nearly every electronic device, from personal computers to home appliances. And they also support high-wage jobs in the mining industry, as well as the production value-added goods in fast-growing markets like electric vehicles. So for the DoD, strategic and critical minerals and materials enable the conventional overmatch of U.S. armed forces and those of our allies and partners. Taking a page from history, industrialized nations that do not have secure and reliable access to these materials in wartime have been compelled to accept performance trade-offs such as ammunition rationing and scarcity-driven production shortfalls, which contributed to their defeat in the battlefield ultimately. And some strategic and critical materials touch almost every facet of our daily lives. And the opportunities and challenges in this sector are a microcosm of the geopolitical and geoeconomic competition that's shaping the 21st century. At the Department of Defense and in industrial base policy specifically, one of our core missions is clear-eyed analysis of this competition and then developing mitigation plans around it. More often than not, global supply chains bring tremendous benefit to the DoD and the U.S. commercial markets. One of these is tightening our alliances and security partnerships. For example, the United States mines zinc in Alaska, which is subsequently refined in Canada to produce purified germanium and zinc compounds. These compounds then move back to the United States and our European allies to produce infrared optics and solar cells for the DoD. Similarly, many of our NATO allies produce energetic materials that we manufacture into missiles and munitions. We export these higher value items to our allies and partners to boost their conventional deterrence and readiness posture. On the other hand, U.S. competitors also are working to turn our global engagement into a vulnerability, and they actively intervene in markets to capture value chains, often working the upstream and downstream to squeeze the middle, as we saw during the pandemic. So domestic production of strategic and critical materials is the ultimate hedge against this risk of deliberate non-market interference in extended overseas supply chains. Production, though, comes in many different shapes and sizes. Primarily production of strategic and critical materials, in a word, mining, is the necessity to increase resilience in global supply chains. And it is equally essential for us to lead the way in the sustainable development of these resources. Similarly, we must take every opportunity to use the resources we have more efficiently, such as co-production in existing mines and extracting critical materials from legacy mining waste. The federal government also can play an important role in reducing administrative barriers to post-consumer recycling of critical materials. As this description of domestic production suggests, the United States must have all of the above approach when it comes to increasing our resilience of critical material supply chains. But I would like to offer that we are under no illusions about the magnitude of this challenge. And at the time that it is required to put into this, we are very, very diligent in applying ourselves and appreciate the support of Congress and others in industry in helping us solve this problem. We know that we cannot resolve our shared exposure to supply chains without working closer with industry, with Congress, and with those allies and partners. So as such, our approach to strategic and critical materials is one of patient, strategic investor. For example, investments under Title III of the Defense Production Act are deliberately structured as a long-term agreement between the government and the industry partner. And this commitment is critical for the capital-intensive projects typical of this sector, as mining is very time-intensive and labor-intensive. A feast or famine, use or lose approach only reinforces the boom-bust cycles in private sector finance, which often leaves us with capability gaps in the industrial base. It's crucial that tools like the DPA are kept flexible with non-expiring funds to ensure that we can continue to invest in the industrial base through these enduring agreements. So in closing and going forward, we're focused on building resilience into our industrial base to be better prepared for future shocks. Notwithstanding the current supply chain pain points, we have every reason to be confident that our supply chain future is bright. There is bipartisan, bicameral, interagency, and national consensus on the need to strengthen U.S. supply chains, and we're committed to working at home and abroad to ensure that we have the leading edge capabilities required for our defense industrial base and broad-based economic growth. So thank you again for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. I look forward to continuing to engage with all of you on this important issue. And I will now turn to Mr. Matt Zolmanowski, who is a highly qualified expert in industrial-based policy and program manager for the DPA, to go into more details. Matt.
Thank you, ma'am. And then Emma, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Sure can.
All right, perfect. I'm going to try the sharing of screen. Give me 1 second. And Emma, can you see my slides as well or no?
Not yet. It says that, oh, here they are. Perfect. You're good to go, Matt.
All right, perfect. So again, thank you for the introduction, ma'am. And by way of short background for those in the group, I joined kind of the DoD circle around critical materials issues, about 5 or 6 years ago, doing work with our National Defense Stockpile Program, assisting them with running some of their economic models of what materials we would require in the event of a national emergency. About 3 years ago, I transitioned over to industrial-based policy where I am today. Again, working as our material sector lead. And then when the pandemic kicked off, shifting over into our Defense Production Act Title III office, and I remain dual-hatted between the two. So just a very quick overview of what we're going to go over. First is just our approach to critical materials issues. How do we evaluate risk in this area? And then we're going to talk about just a very brief stoplight chart of where we are in actually implementing the core recommendations from the 14017 process, which touches on DPA among other issues. So the first item, what is DoD's approach to critical materials? And you may find it unsurprising, but we actually get this question quite a bit, not only from the mining and chemical processing industry, but especially from our defense primes and our major subs. And so when we have those discussions, we can sum it up in truly just this phrase. If the slide transition will work. There you go. If you had to execute the national defense strategy tomorrow, are you ready? Could you do it? So again, the National Defense Strategy sets out some very clear objectives with respect to defending the homeland, preventing strategic attack upon the United States, and if necessary, being prepared to fight and win against a peer adversary in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe. And as you would imagine, the requirements of that kind of an undertaking are very significant. And so when we have these discussions with industry, it can really boil down to simply this question. Knowing what you know about your supply chain, or alternatively, knowing what you don't know about your supply chain, are you ready? And then what would you need to do to get ready and to be prepared for that undertaking? So with that in mind, DoD undertakes a lot of reporting activities, and especially of late related to strategic and critical materials. But the important thing to note is that DoD has been sending a regular report to the Hill every 2 years. It specifically goes to the Armed Services Committees and I believe to the appropriators as well, that tries to get after exactly this question, which is if we were called upon to execute a national emergency contingency scenario, what materials would we have? What materials would we run out of? And what are the requirements for either stockpiling, emergency investment under DPA Title III, or other activities to try and shore up the resilience of the defense industrial base and also the essential civilian economy? Again, wholly unsurprisingly, the results of this modeling work are classified. So if there are folks who would like to get that briefing afterwards, you simply need to reach out to us, and we're happy to come by and run through it in detail. But we did find, or rather we did release some of the unclassified results of that modeling exercise in the 100-day 14017 report itself. And then again, for those who are interested, the next version of this modeling scenario is going to be available in the beginning of calendar year 2023. Now, the most important finding from this modeling, and again, it's borne out in certainly practical experience. If you think about the impact of not just COVID-19, but obviously the legacy supply chain repercussions that continue to ripple through supply chains today. The scenario itself, the actual contingency scenario, does not actually create the vulnerability in a particular supply chain. Instead, you need to understand that the only thing the scenario is doing is it is simply levying a uniquely intense requirement on top of a vulnerability that already exists right now. That's a critical takeaway. And the next piece is, again, we've been running this scenario every 2 years since 2009. And in every single modeling run, yes, absolutely, the Department of Defense has critical needs for these materials. But far and away, it's the essential civilian market that is taking the brunt of the harm during these emergencies. And so as we think about this contingency scenario, it's really important that whatever solution set we come up with is tailored to resolving and addressing civilian needs first, as well as those of the military. More specifically, as we think about the types of risk factors that we're seeing in our various supply chain analyses, many of these factors are kind of well known to folks in industry, but as a matter of concentration of supply, again, if you can think of the call it the USGS Christmas tree chart that shows our import reliance. There are a significant number of materials that have a large amount of reliance on foreign sources that dominate global markets. Similarly, as we survey our supply chains, there's a tremendous amount of either a complete absence of domestic production, that was mentioned by Congressman Swalwell, as well as single points of failure across our supply chains. And again, the key point here about energetic materials, a number of those materials which we can directly tie to ammunition programs have a similar sole source reliance. The role of China is absolutely pervasive across all of these material markets, Russia as well. And specific to China, there has been a number of activities from the Department of Commerce and other agencies to try and police up their trading practices that are not in line with norms that we have all signed up through the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade and other institutions. And then lastly, this is one where actually I don't mean this to be too much of a kind of cheerleading activity, but I really would like to extend my thanks to kind of both kind of houses of Congress for this last point, and that is, from the end of the Cold War up until frankly about 2017, 2014, the National Defense Stockpile funding revenue stream was pushed to lots of other programs. Ironically, the construction of the World War II Memorial, just the O&M accounts for the military services, the General Treasury Fund, and a number of other places. And there was a very significant going concern risk for the stability of the stockpile program. However, the Congress stepped in very significantly in last year's budget, appropriating $125 million to the National Defense Stockpile Transaction Fund. And that has gone a long way to kind of pushing us back from the edge of where we were with this program. And so, again, we do have pending legislation, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. But again, I would like to extend my thanks to all on the Hill who worked on this item in particular, because we are in a much better place today, precisely because of the actions that all of you have taken. Looking at the 14017 report holistically, again, as I mentioned before, all of our modeling drives at the fact that, yes, the military has unique needs for these materials. But at the same time, as we look at the contingency scenario itself, it's the civilian market, it's the civilian economy that really, really gets hurt the worst in one of these kinds of disruptions. And so because of that, we need to start with those solutions that will start to guide and shape commercial market activity onto a more sustainable and onto a more resilient foundation. And so the first part of that is actually working with our non-defense agency partners to introduce new sustainability standards for critical materials in particular. You can see this through long-running sustainability standards such as EPEAT and similar eco-label activities. And again, this is the type of thing that's a kind of rising tide lifts all ships. Again, to shift from the point of view of simply one that drives at cost. What is the lowest cost source that I can find, whether it's in China, in Congo, or wherever it happens to be? And how do I instead introduce a value proposition that says, hey, if I buy this in a particular way or build it in a particular type of way, I can actually gain additional margin and my brand can gain additional value because I've decided to do business in a different way. The next piece is expanding sustainable production. Again, this is bread and butter of what the Defense Production Act Title III program can do. Certainly has done so throughout the pandemic period. And as was mentioned previously, the Biden administration has also put significant emphasis on using the Defense Production Act Title III to support domestic production of strategic and critical materials for large capacity batteries. That being said, though, DPA Title III is not the only tool, and sometimes it's not the best tool to get the job done. And that's where, development finance, from, again, Development Finance Corporation, loans or credit assistance, say from the Export-Import Bank or the DOE loan program, or some of the other funding opportunities that are available through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So again, it's really about what is the best tool for the particular problem that you're trying to solve. Lastly, I mentioned this on the previous slide, and that is strengthening U.S. stockpiles. So, notwithstanding all of the other activities about sustainability standards or, trying to increase domestic sourcing, there may simply be a very large delta between what the requirement is during the emergency and what industry is capable of sustaining through a normal business case in peacetime. Or alternatively, as Congressman Swalwell mentioned at the top, there may simply be so much risk in a supply chain that the only reasonable approach to hedge that risk is to have a robust stockpiling program. And again, this is an area where we've been working regularly with the Congress over the past year and more, not only from a resourcing standpoint, but also for additional, more flexible authorities. And again, I just like to extend my thanks to those on the Hill that we've been working with on this issue. And then lastly is working with allies and partners. Critical materials is an interesting issue set where on the one hand, geology really drives policy. No amount of policy is going to change where the minerals are or where they are not. And so that basic fact set compels us to work with our allies and partners to make sure that we're all on the same sheet of music when it comes to not just the sustainable sourcing of materials, but also diversifying global supply chains. I think if folks have been paying attention to some of the remarks from Secretary Granholm and others in Australia, we're all kind of rowing in the same direction on this front. Last is, this is the stoplight chart that just reflects, where we are from an implementation standpoint. And that is, again, I'm very happy to report that there's a tremendous amount of green on this chart. There are a number of provisions that are currently pending before the Congress, not just the 23 budget, but the 23 National Defense Authorization Act, again, which the Congressman mentioned at the top. So I'm certainly hopeful that more of these yellow areas will flip to green as we go forward through this year's legislative cycle. And that really opens the door for us to move beyond, coming to the Congress and continually asking for things to then just simply executing the programs that we have. So we're very much looking forward to continuing to close out the tasks that we have and then building on that success going into the years ahead. So with that, I don't have any further question or remarks for the group. And so I'll hold right there unless Emma, you want to open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you both for this really comprehensive overview of how DoD is working with the domestic critical materials industry. And to your last point there, also work with allied nations as we think about how do we secure the supply chain as strategically as possible. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move us into a panel discussion, but I think that teed us up really well, thinking about DPA Title III, stockpiling and working with allies. Those are all topics I want us to cover now on the industry side, and maybe that will build well off of what you said, Matt. So welcome you both to stay on or leave if you wish, and I'll have our rare earth panelists join now, and I think I have you all with me. So perfect, thank you. And thank you again, Matt and Ms. Najib Block for joining us. With that, I'll do quick intros with our rare earth element panelists. As a reminder for each of you, name, organization you're with. Want to keep these relatively short and then dive in on some Q&A to get a better sense of what specifically is happening around the US and in the world in the rare earths space. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Dan with USA Rare Earth to get us started.
Thank you, Emma, appreciate it. And I do want to thank both Assistant Secretary Najib Block and Matt Zolnowski from DoD, Congressman Swalwell and your colleague Congressman Reschenthaler and the caucus for really bringing this issue into the spotlight. It's such a a key component of policy underneath all the major discussions that we have, and yet it just hasn't been pulled up into a prominent position. I serve in an advisory role at USA Rare Earth, as Emma mentioned. I was thinking about just quickly positioning, this task of building a complete US-based rare earth magnet supply chain. There's many other important rare earth applications outside the magnet space, but the magnet space is clearly the prominent one among them, and will be, I think, for a good long while. It's a little bit like shotgun start in golf, where you are trying to begin play all over the course at the same time. In the instance of rare earths and standing up a domestic-based supply chain, you've got to advance a mining project to extract the rare earths. You've got to develop in the United States a separation processing capability, separation as they call it in the rare earth space in the United States. You've got to reconstitute metallization, reduction to metals, and alloying the rare earths. And I'm just talking now about moving it into the magnet supply chain. And then finally, permanent magnet production, NdFeB, and also to, whatever extent is necessary, SMCO, samarium cobalt as well. That's the objective that USA Rare Earth has set for itself. The company has the advantage of having, in order to be able to do this in the US at every stage, and not simply, have an interruption in any single link that just, the missing any single link really stops the chain from functioning in the way that we want it to function, in the way that both of the DoD speakers made very, very clear just a few minutes ago. That just simply moves the problem to the right, moves it from upstream to downstream. In the instance of USA Rare Earth, it starts with, it's anchored in the rare earth deposit at Round Top in Southwest Texas, which is an extremely unusual deposit in that it hosts all of the rare earths, including, for our discussion today, the principal magnet rare earths, that not just the lights, neodymium, praseodymium, but dysprosium and terbium, which are important for the high performance magnets. And in fact, I think have a even more significant importance for DoD related, national security related applications. We're working in Colorado on a separation, a technique called continuous ion exchange. I bring it up because it's very versatile in contrast to many rare earth separation techniques that require, that have to be tuned to a specific deposit. It is actually accepting, CIX is accepting of feedstocks from multiple places. That's really important to onshore the rare earth supply chain. And then finally, and most recently, the company announced the opening in Oklahoma and Stillwater of a hub facility that will host the metallization of rare earths, the alloying functions, and finally the production of permanent magnets. So we're working diligently to bring all of those into the same space. Excited about the opportunity today because it's so important to bring the public policy focus and mandate together with private innovation, private investment to solve this problem. And I think it's very clear that we have to solve it and solve it soon. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Matt with MP.
Thanks, Emma. I'm Matt Flosher, the Senior Vice President for Communications and Policy at MP Materials. MP is the only scaled and operational rare earth materials producer in America today. Our story has humble beginnings. It began 5 years ago with the acquisition of Mountain Pass, which is a site in California that at one point led the global rare earth industry, but it sat idle in 2017. It's been quite a journey over the past 5 years. Today, we are a profitable public company traded on the New York Stock Exchange with around 450 employees. And Mountain Pass is actually more productive today than ever in its 70-year history. As a company, we are quickly moving downstream to fulfill our mission to restore the full rare earth supply chain to the United States, from mining and separation to magnet making and recycling, all while setting a global benchmark for environmental sustainability, which is critical. So I look forward to sharing more about our story with everyone that's joined. And I really want to thank you and the Caucus and the Defense Department for organizing the forum and the opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. And Dr. Tom Lagrasso, on to you.
Thank you. I'm Tom Lagrasso. I am at the Ames Laboratory at Department of Energy National Laboratory, and I am the director of the Critical Materials Institute. I too wish to thank the organizers and the Critical Materials Caucus for the opportunity to share the things we've been doing. The Critical Materials Institute is an energy innovation hub supported by the Department of Energy. It is a public-private partnership with a mission to accelerate innovative scientific and technical solutions that are needed to develop resilient and sustainable and secure supply chains for the rare earth metals, but as well as other materials critical for clean energy technologies. We focus on rare earths for permanent magnets, lithium, cobalt, and graphite, nickel for battery systems, and indium, gallium, and tellurium for electronic applications. The Institute consists of 4 national laboratories, 15 academic institutions, 32 private companies, and we harness the R&D innovation engine at these institutions to deliver the innovations needed for both an economically and environmentally sound supply chains. Overall, we strive to reduce energy and carbon footprint at all stages of the supply chain, from mineral processing through refining, alloy, and manufacturing. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. I think already hearing from all of you kind of this layered in focus on national security and sustainability. I think that kind of plays into a message that BMTC certainly talks a lot about, which is how can we do this industry better here in the US, right? So I think all of you are hitting on that with the rare earth space. I think really quickly before moving into our battery material intros, one final piece before diving into the Q&As, I'd just like to ask any one of you in particular to just speak a little bit to where else in the world are you seeing rare earth production happening? Maybe let's start with Matt quickly, just provide us a brief overview of, where else globally is this production really happening? And I think that's kind of sets the scene for a broader discussion.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start with history. When you look back, the US through Mountain Pass led the global rare earth industry for decades, from the 60s to the 80s. But beginning in the 1980s, the entire supply chain essentially was systematically hollowed out and offshored predominantly to China. And today, China is the dominant player across the full supply chain in mining and separation, as well as metal and magnet making, which presents a serious economic and national security vulnerability, as the Defense Department noted. When MP closed on the acquisition for Mountain Pass in 2017, there were 8 people there keeping the lights on. The site was very close to losing its permit. The US had no rare earth production across the full supply chain to speak of. And we've made a lot of progress, thankfully, since that time. So today we make a concentrate that represents around 15% of global production. And we operate a highly profitable business that's generating enough cash flow that enables us to invest and move downstream to fulfill our mission. So alongside 2 significant awards from the Department of Defense, we're investing $700 million over the next 2 years to restore refining and separation capabilities to Mountain Pass for both light and heavy rare earth. And we're also constructing a magnetics facility in Texas. And General Motors is the foundational automotive customer for that facility. So in late 2023, we will begin supplying GM with magnetic alloy produced in Texas from feed in California for more than 12 EVs on their Ultium platform. So from very humble beginnings, we've come a long way in a short period of time. And I think there's reason for optimism in the sector when you see the growing alignment on the part of business and government, the rapid commercial progress we are making, and really the fact that we're at the beginning of a very durable demand-driven cycle that creates great opportunity in the space.
I think that's a message we'll hear from the battery materials folks as well. So I'll have you all join us now too, is just the role that China plays across the different critical materials sectors more broadly. A lot of control coming out of China. So if I can have Todd, Melissa, and Danielle also turn on their cameras. I think we'll do some quick introductions from them, and then I want to tie this all together into a bigger discussion on what else is needed to help the work that you all are already starting to do here. So with that, I'd love to kick it over to Melissa with Piedmont Lithium to start our introductions.
Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Gordon, Head of Government and Community Affairs for Piedmont Lithium. A little bit about us. Piedmont Lithium is currently developing a world-class multi-asset integrated lithium business to support the creation of a clean energy economy in North America and to help secure America's energy independence. The centerpiece of our operation, the Carolina Lithium Project, is located in the renowned Carolina 10 spodumene belt of North Carolina. And this project, combined with our equity investments and strategic partnerships that own key lithium assets in both Ghana and Canada, as well as a second planned US lithium hydroxide plant, uniquely positions Piedmont Lithium to be one of the largest, lowest cost, most sustainable producers of lithium hydroxide in the world. And we will also be the most strategically located to best serve the fast-growing North American electric vehicle supply chain. The geology, geography, proximity, and planned production timeline of our operations should allow us to deliver a valuable and continuous supply of high-quality, sustainably produced lithium hydroxide from spodumene concentrate. I will pass it on. I know we've got a lot to cover. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. And now Todd with Talon Metals.
Thanks so much, Emma. Really appreciate it. Great to be here. I'm Todd Mayland. I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer for Talon Metals. We're developing the major high-grade nickel deposit in central Minnesota, the Tamarack Nickel Project. And we have a offtake agreement with Tesla that we signed in January of this year. And we are soon to be entering into the state permitting process here in Minnesota. And hopefully we'll be up and producing nickel for the US EV battery supply chain, as well as other critical battery materials that are byproducts of our deposit in 2026.
Wonderful. Thank you, Todd. And Danielle with Service Solutions.
Hi. So my name is Danielle Spalding. I'm the VP of Communications and Marketing at Service Solutions. First, like everyone, I do want to just take a moment to say thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. This is really a topic that is absolutely critical for national security of the United States. I think this is a great group of people overall, and I think has been good discussion and good points so far. But I think that also so much more to come. For those that may or may not know this, but Service Solutions is actually a strategic combination of 3 different organizations: Heritage Battery Recycling, Retrieve Technologies, and Battery Solutions. And it creates the most comprehensive and vertically integrated battery management and materials provider for end-of-life batteries for the lithium-ion EV supply chain. We've actually been operating for over 30 years with experience in collecting, sorting, and processing end-of-life batteries into reusable materials, such as new batteries. We have 6 actual strategic locations that are already operational throughout North America, 2 of which are lithium-ion facilities. And those others process a range of chemistries from nickel-based, alkaline, lithium primary batteries, and more. I think that we really want to make sure that we focus on a lot of key areas that are helping support the collection of these critical materials, and battery collection is absolutely one of that, because when we are able to capture those critical materials that are already here, it would have otherwise been thrown away, or we may have to do more foreign source. So recycling plays a critical component in overall a domestic supply chain that is sustainable and also provide sustained production of possibilities. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Danielle. And I think similar to what I did last time, before diving in quickly, I just want to provide a little bit of scene setting. So Todd, I'd love to turn it over to you. I think nickel in particular has been in the news a lot given Russia's control of nickel supply chains globally. And so I think it'd be wonderful to have you talk briefly about nickel, but also other battery materials and where are we seeing those supply chains most prominently controlled, and why is it so important then that the US scale its own capabilities here? And you're on mute, Todd. Had to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, Emma. I think nickel is one of those items in the battery supply chain that there's a real consensus around, that there's both a geopolitical angle around security of supply, being that Russia is a major supplier of nickel to global markets, and Chinese controlled nickel deposits in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia, also create a security of supply issue in that particular issue. If you look at the announced battery manufacturing in the US over the last year, it's about $25 billion worth of announced investment in the battery supply chain for battery manufacturing. All of that capacity, manufacturing capacity, is based on nickel-based chemistries for those batteries. So it's a really vital ingredient. And I think what people are actually waking up to the fact is that we have nickel right here in the United States. The US Geological Survey has been doing a lot of work in what's known as the Lake Superior Mid-Continental Rift area, which is where I am today in Tamarack, Minnesota. That Mid-Continental Rift area extends from Iowa up through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. And you have, the only operating nickel mine in the United States, the Eagle Mine in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But because we don't have processing capability in the United States, you actually have those Michigan nickel elements being sent to Canada and then to Finland to be processed into the battery grade material. By the time it gets to Finland, it's most likely to end up in the Chinese battery supply chain. So it's a bit of a folly, really, that because we don't have that processing capability in the United States, that you actually have Michigan supplying the Chinese battery supply chain. So hopefully that is something that, with these new resources and the bipartisan consensus and the good work of Matt and others at DOD and others in the government, we actually now can address this fact that we've got the geology and we've got high grade deposits, but we need the processing. So that'll be one of the things that I hope that we'll be able to solve for. And with our agreement with Tesla, we're also going to be working with Tesla to actually take that all the way through to a completely US nickel supply chain into the cathode. And just one kind of fun show and tell, I'm here in Tamarack, Minnesota. I guess my blurring may hold this out, but this is a core sample with about 12% nickel, and it's just been polished, and it's almost metallic looking. So we do have the really high grade resources here in the United States. We just have to be able to mine them and then process them.
Thanks, Todd. And I think that tees us up well. And something we talk about a lot is, in the US, we have the innovative backbone with our national labs, and we have the materials in the ground here. And to Danielle's point, we're also currently recycling, and we've seen the impact the recycling industry can have in other industries. And so I think it's all about scale now, right? And that's what we talk about a lot. And so I think this takes us into a discussion on what is working and what more is needed as we think about how can government help industry scale today. And so since we had Matt join us earlier, I do want to talk a bit about DPA Title III first and the impact that program has. Matt, I know I've been picking on you, but MP Materials has worked with the DPA Title III program before. So just really briefly, can you provide us a little bit insight into the value add that you've seen in working with the Title III program?
Yeah, no problem, Emma. And it's been a really positive experience for us. So we've received 2 awards totaling $45 million through the DPA and IBAS programs to restore that critical refining and separations capability. The first was in late 2020, and the second was announced earlier this year by the president. One thing I'd note is, importantly, alongside that $45 million, we've committed $700 million of private capital. And I think that's really important. if you have resiliency in this space, the private sector absolutely must lead. But capital aside, I think one thing the awards do is they distinguish economically viable projects and technically capable teams. These are competitive processes with rigorous business and technical evaluations. Before we received award, we had a commercially proven business and a profitable business, and we had a credible plan to move downstream. And so I think when you meet that high bar, it sends a signal. The second thing that I'd mentioned is intangible, but incredibly valuable. We work really hard to create a mission-oriented culture here at MP. And when you land a DPA project, it sends a message to your employees, to your partners, to your suppliers, to really all of your stakeholders that this really matters. And that is incredibly motivating in our experience. When people go to work every day and they know that the work they do is more than a day job, they'll move mountains to succeed. And that's both literally and figuratively what it takes in this space. And I think the last thing is, when you're associated with a DPA project, the great folks at the DoD can help you navigate the complexities of the federal government. And other agencies across government inherently know what your capabilities are, where you're at on your journey, what your pain points are, because these projects are very closely monitored. And so despite the heat that they take publicly, the public servants across government that work on this issue day in and day out, they're incredibly motivated, they're talented, and they're very well positioned to help when it counts. And so I think DPA is a great foot in the door to engage that entire interagency very credibly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. And I'll flag now. I think I'm going to let us go a few minutes over. So hopefully folks can stay with us. We've just had such a wonderful roster of speakers, and I want to get to a few more points, even though I know we're coming up on 3:30. But thinking about DPA Title III, I think an important aspect of it with the recent expansion and presidential determination allowing battery materials to be eligible is in part that included recycled materials. And so Danielle, I think it'd be wonderful to hear from you a bit on the value in seeing recycled battery materials as part of the new DPA Title III authorities. And what else do you think is needed when we think about scaling a circular critical materials industry here in the US?
Yeah, thanks. I think that, the DPA Title III guidance, because it specifically calls out recycling of these critical minerals to ensure we're truly developing a sustainable supply chain. We think about developing this ecosystem, which essentially will create a robust supply that will then serve industries for multiple decades, right? And it's about, like we mentioned, we are spending billions, right, to go ahead and do virgin mining and have all of this effort and investment, and then be able to bring that material in or have it through our soil. And we don't want to be able to put it back in. We want to use it again so we can enhance its life cycle through sustainability. But the first thing we need to do is enhance our collection efforts. It is the first step. We use a stat often, which is the lead acid battery, right? A new lead acid battery contains 80% of a recycled old lead acid battery. We know that the recycling infrastructure can work, and we know that the materials are out there. We've heard earlier on, these battery materials are in our watches, our cell phones, the laptops we're using, the mice that we have like on the computer right now, right? Oh, thanks, Blair. Can't get it out there. And we think about this idea that all of these critical materials that we need, right? We need to be able to collect them through the existing devices that are here, and then also through the increasing electric vehicle supply chain that is enhancing within the United States. And so we know that demand is almost going to grow like 60 times for electric vehicles that are going to be on the road by 2040. But that means that the scrap by itself is going to increase significantly in manufacturing. And then also the availability of batteries at end of life from those electric vehicles are going to be coming up. So we want to ensure that not only they're diverted from landfills, but they help support the domestic supply that we truly need to help enhance the production efforts. Because for the infrastructure to really work, then the market needs, such as cell manufacturing, cathode production, mineral conversion, is critical, because key and strategic partnerships we know are happening and the continuation through the supply chain. But thoughtful discussions like this, when it comes to securing those by themselves, is absolutely important. But even in that, we have to talk about regionalizing that supply, because people are going to want to have supplies close to their manufacturing and production efforts. And recycling those batteries that already exist can help support part of that supply that we know we have to have, because there's a huge gap right now with what getting in and then what is going to be coming in even in the next 8 to 10 years.
Right, thanks, Danielle. And I think that kind of hints toward, what else is needed. And I'd be remiss without taking the opportunity during our briefing today to talk about Representative Swalwell and Rushenthaler's rare earth magnet manufacturing PTC. And so I do want to turn it over. Perhaps Dan, can you talk a bit about the value that a PTC provides for the industry and maybe what else you see is needed to scale rare earth and rare earth magnet production here in the US?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Emma. And I'm glad to have that opportunity. Congressman Swalwell and Congressman Rushenthaler have introduced the tax credit bill, and I, do hope that it is included as an amendment and passes. It's, I think, very, very well targeted. It's not, the charge of picking winners and losers. It is very much using public policy as a mechanism to incentivize private investment, to incentivize private innovation. It's kind of first past the post. You get the credit if you produce the material. And the other piece of it is, it's at least a first step. It's not full parity, but it's at least a full step towards leveling the playing field with China, which is the dominant factor in the magnet and rare earth permanent magnet space. China rebates a VAT tax back to the producers there, creating a disparity that makes it very difficult for entrants in the market outside of China. And the tax credit concept, not concept, but the bill in terms of the way it's very carefully written by the congressman, I think is a really strong first step in that direction. So very strong advocate of that. I think it'll be very, very helpful. And I think it's an instance of one of those policies where it's calibrated to work with private sector and not to supplant a public policy position on top of the private sector. So that's my take on it. I think the last point I would make just very quickly is the ability to use the full set of tools in the DPA toolkit is extraordinarily important, and the opportunity to do those, to employ those tools in an innovative way is a great opportunity. It's an absolutely essential one for us to experiment with. And then Matt Zolnowski mentioned as kind of the backstop. In some instances, there's nothing, you must stockpile material. And the stockpile has been rated for a long, long time to the tune of, I don't know, $3-4 billion, which was supposed to cycle back to the stockpile and was used for general purposes. And any step in the direction, and beginning steps have been made to redress that, is very, very important. It's hard to see how we're, I just came back from Canada, where in Quebec, they stockpile maple syrup. And, we argue over stockpiling critical minerals. I think we have to get the balance right again when it comes to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. And actually bringing up Canada segues me well into my next point, which is, I think, working with allies more broadly. And Melissa, I'd love to turn it over to you, because I think Piedmont and lithium more broadly have an interesting story to share around the importance of working with allied countries as we think about securing critical materials.
Yeah, it's critical that we all work with all of our allies and partners across the industry and government to make sure this development happens, and that we see the value here at home. We all know too well today that the US relies heavily on importing advanced battery materials from abroad, exposing the nation to this supply chain vulnerability, that the threat to disrupt the availability and the cost of these technologies. And not only that, but the workforce that manufactures them, that we're losing that. And so Piedmont's a firm believer in it takes a village, and that working closely with all of our partners and our allies will combat this reliance on other countries. You know, the resource is here, the jobs are here, the technology or the ability to work and expand our technology to process is here. And if we continue to work together, we can stop the reliance on other countries. And it should be at the forefront of everyone's mind when we think national security, you know, that we all work together to combat it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melissa. And I think that, you know, looking ahead, I'd love to turn to Tom. Where do you see the future of innovation in this space going? And what do you think is next in the critical materials industry?
A couple of facets on innovation that I'd like to talk about. One is going to be overall reducing material and energy intensity across the supply chain. You know, we work with a number of different companies on the call today, and many of the processes in taking a mineral resource and turning it into something useful are very, very energy intensive. And the key, I think, will be to reduce that, make it a lower carbon footprint, use of less energies through reducing temperatures or finding alternative processing pathways, whether it's, well, it's really for most minerals across the board. The rare earths are particular examples where the metal refining are super high temperatures, and we need to find different ways to do that. Similar sort of innovations are needed for the recycling. Collection is the first and biggest, as Danielle indicated. But even so, you know, battery chemistries are changing. We need flexible processes that can handle that, and being able to have platforms for recovering, extracting and recovering smaller quantities of these materials from larger devices, and getting that into a form that can be reinserted back into supply chain. And we need to do it using green pathways, environmentally sound processing. We continue to develop acid-free approaches to extracting rare earths from various devices and working that back into the feedstocks for rare earth production. And then something I'd like to mention that isn't so much technical innovation, we really need to develop the workforce. And you know, we do what we can in the Institute, but that effort really does need to be enhanced across virtually all of the industry sectors. We have to have the people to be able to produce these materials and do it in ways that are reproducible, and I'm a firm believer in investing in our next generation. So I had to throw that out. Thank you.
Love it. Thank you, Tom. And I agree. I wish we had more time. I think there's so many issues we could dive in on, whether it be workforce development. Todd, you talked about the need for processing in particular. I think that's a hugely important topic for the US to be thinking about. Recycling, how we're tying all these industries together. A few of you mentioned the need to think about this on an even more local level. I think all of you can speak to the hubs you're seeing being developed just in the United States alone in terms of where companies are doing this work and how they're structuring that right across the country. So with that, I do want to be mindful of time and not drag us on too long. That being said, I know for our attendees, thank you so much for joining. And I know everyone that you see here today would love to continue the conversation. So if any of you have any burning questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, and my email should be in the chat. And we can put you in contact with any of the panelists you see here today. And I know all of us would love to keep this conversation going. So thank you again to our caucus co-chairs for making the briefing today possible. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I've certainly learned something and hope all of our attendees have as well. And with that, I'll thank you all for joining and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.